What does a soldier feel? When the moment he pulls the trigger, he already knows he's lost. The desert wind screamed across El Alamein, dry, merciless, alive with the growl of engines preparing for battle. Inside an Italian M1340 tank, sweat dripped from the steel ceiling as dust hung in the air like smoke. The cramped interior was filled with fear disguised as bravery. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci, just 23, adjusted his goggles and stared across the dunes where dark shapes moved, bigger, faster, newer than anything Italy had ever faced. His gunner's trembling voice broke the silence. "Tenente." "They say the British have a new tank." Pascucci did not answer because he'd already seen the truth in the morning haze, tall silhouettes with broad hulls and thick armor glinting under the sun. Shermans, their first real fight in North Africa. For the Italians, it felt like watching a new kind of war arrive, one they were not built for. The numbers were announced, like a death sentence. 278 Italian tanks against 252 American-made Shermans. It sounded fair, even balanced. But every man inside those Italian machines knew the numbers lied. The M1340's armor, 42 millimeters. The Sherman's gun could rip through that from over a kilometer away. Their own 47 millimeters gun? It could only penetrate a Sherman at dangerously close range, almost point blank. It meant one thing, to have even a chance. The Italians had to drive straight into hell. Then the order came, simple, cold, unquestionable, Ariete division, advance. Tracks clattered against rock and sand as the Italian line rolled forward, engines screaming to push aging machines faster than they were ever meant to go. Pascucci stood partially exposed from his hatch, wind cutting across his face, eyes focused forward. Below him, some crewmen crossed themselves. Others kissed medals or quietly whispered the names of children, wives, or mothers. No one pretended they were equal, not today. Across the desert, the Sherman barrels lowered, smooth, deliberate, confident. Then the world exploded. The first American shots hit with terrifying precision. An Italian tank vanished in fire. Another lost its turret in a burst of molten steel. Pascucci watched one crew jump from their burning vehicle, uniforms aflame, screaming until the desert swallowed them. The Italians fired back, shells arcing hitting Shermans, but bouncing off harmlessly. A Sherman gunner would later recall it felt like shooting at cardboard. Yet the Italians did not stop. They pushed forward, bleeding, burning, breaking, but still advancing. Pascucci's tank was hit, armor buckling, but he refused to retreat. He ordered full speed, charging a group of Shermans alone. His final moments were chaos. Smoke filling the turret, engine failing, guns firing until the barrel glowed red. Some say his last act was ramming a Sherman, giving cover to retreating Italians. His tank was found with the hull torn apart, crew still inside. And yet, months later, those same Italian soldiers who survived would stand in America as prisoners of war and stare in shock at assembly lines producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, at warehouses overflowing with food, trucks, and, worst of all, tanks. 49,000 Shermans. Italy had built barely 3,000 total armored vehicles. In that moment, many finally understood they had never been fighting soldiers. They had been fighting an industrial empire. And the war had been decided long before the first shot. In the scorching October heat of 1942, under the unforgiving glare of the North African sun, the Second Battle of El Alamein was about to explode. A showdown that would decide the fate of an entire theater of war. For months, the Axis armies, German and Italian, had pushed toward Egypt, toward the Suez Canal, toward a dream of controlling the Middle East and its crucial oil. But now the tide was turning. Facing off against the British Eighth Army, backed for the first time by American industry, were the proud but strained Italian armored forces of the 132nd Ariete Armored Division, men like Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci, a young officer commanding an aging M1340 tank. He and his crew had already tasted battle at places like Bir el Gubi, where they had once famously thrown back British armor, fighting with raw courage that nearly made up for worn-out machines. But today, the stakes were higher than ever. If the Axis line broke here, if El Alamein fell, the desert would become a highway straight back into Libya, and the dream of conquering Africa would collapse in the sand. The Italians were fighters, brave, resourceful, committed to their duty, but they were trapped by a cruel imbalance. While they rolled into battle inside tanks barely protected by 42 millimeters of armor and armed with small 47 millimeters guns, their enemy unleashed a brand new weapon onto the battlefield. The American M4 Sherman, thick-skinned, fast, and packing a devastating 75 millimeters cannon that could punch through an M1340 before Italian crews ever saw it coming. It wasn't just a clash of tanks. It was a collision between two worlds. one fueled by Mussolini's propaganda and dwindling resources, the other by American factories capable of unimaginable output, stamping out tanks and aircraft at a rate no Axis nation could match. For the Italian soldiers, many from humble families, it was a brutal awakening to the bitter truth that valor alone could not win a mechanized war. And yet they fought, not because victory was promised, but because courage demanded it. Pascucci, who would earn Italy's Medaglia d'Oro of Valor Militare Gold Medal of Military Valor, embodied that spirit, facing overwhelming armor head-on, sacrificing himself so that others might escape. But the tragedy and triumph of this story doesn't end on the battlefield, because many of the men who survived Alamein would later be shipped across the Atlantic as prisoners of war, landing not in misery but in America, a place so rich and industrially powerful it seemed like another planet entirely. There, Italian POWs saw the endless rows of food, the abundance of clothing, the flood of vehicles and aircraft rolling off assembly lines, like the famous Willow Run plant producing a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. They compared that to Italy, where factories were few, resources scarce, and tanks counted in the hundreds, not tens of thousands. By war's end, these same men, once loyal fascist soldiers, would join Italian service units, working alongside Americans, many returning home believing not in Mussolini but in democracy. That transformation, from proud warriors fighting a hopeless battle to allies reshaping their country's future, is what makes this story worth hearing. It reveals a rare truth, that defeat can become the beginning of rebirth, that respect can grow between men who were once enemies, that history isn't just about who wins the battle, but who learns from it. This is not only the story of steel versus steel or technology overpowering courage. It's the story of young tankers who realized in one terrifying moment that their world was smaller, weaker, and more fragile than they had ever been told, and how that realization changed them forever. This is the story of Italian tankers who fought the Sherman and discovered just how hopelessly outmatched they were. Before the clash at El Alamein, the North African desert had already become a graveyard of ambitions, burned-out tank hulls, shattered supply columns, and broken promises. For 2 years, Italy had tried to prove itself a modern military power, marching alongside Hitler's Germany with dreams of empire, but reality was harsher than any propaganda film Mussolini ever broadcast. Italy entered the war with outdated factories, limited steel, and aging designs. Machines like the M1340, a tank that had been considered acceptable in 1940 but hopelessly obsolete by 1942. Yet the men inside those machines, mechanics from Turin, farmers from Sicily, and students from Milan, still believed they were serving something larger than themselves. Among them was 2nd Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci, young and determined, a tanker who had survived earlier armored clashes at Bardia and Bir el Gubi, where Italy's armored divisions had surprised the British with ferocious resistance. But now, as autumn approached, the situation had changed. The British Eighth Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, had regrouped, reinforced, and rearmed with something the Italians had never faced before: the industrial muscle of the United States. American factories, massive, assembly lines in places like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, were now supplying Britain with fresh equipment, including hundreds of brand-new M4 Sherman tanks that would arrive just in time for the decisive battle. While Italy and Germany struggled to produce tanks by the dozens, the United States was now producing them by the hour. In the weeks leading up to the battle, British supply trucks poured into staging areas near the front, carrying food, ammunition, radios, spare parts, and fuel. So much fuel that some soldiers joked the desert smelled like gasoline instead of sand. In sharp contrast, the Axis side, especially the Italians, were starving for resources. Tank crews rationed water so carefully that one soldier later said, "We drank like lizards, drop by drop." Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep surviving machines running. Even fuel was precious. Some Italian armored units could barely move, saving every liter for the coming attack. Meanwhile, the desert itself seemed to take sides. Days were blistering, nights freezing, and windstorms erased tracks, swallowed equipment, and reduced visibility to nothing. The air often tasted like dust and metal, and the horizon shimmered with heat, making distant tanks appear like ghosts. Yet despite these conditions, morale in the Ariete armored division remained strangely steady, not because they believed they could win, but because they had no choice except to fight. By late October, intelligence reports confirmed what officers feared. The British were massing overwhelming firepower, and among their forces were 252 Sherman tanks, fresh, powerful, and untested in real battle, but undeniably superior in design. The Shermans had 76mm thick frontal armor, wide tracks that handled sand better, radios in every vehicle for coordinated movement, and a 75mm gun capable of killing most Axis tanks long before they reached firing range. The Italians still clung to the hope that individual bravery might overcome mechanical inferiority. Pascucci's men prepared their M1340 like a knight polishing old armor before a duel, checking bearings, loading ammunition, reinforcing weak welds, tightening track bolts. They knew their riveted armor could become shrapnel when struck, but they climbed inside anyway. The night before the battle, the desert was deceptively calm. The stars hung low and bright as if watching. Some soldiers smoked silently, others prayed. A few wrote letters they had no expectation of mailing. Scouts returned with the final confirmation, enemy armor massing in formation, Shermans among them. "They look big, Signor," one scout said quietly, refusing to meet his officer's eyes. When dawn finally broke on October 23, 1942, the world did not wake, it erupted. The British opened with Operation Lightfoot, a rolling artillery barrage so massive that Italian soldiers described the sky as a single sheet of fire. The ground shook, air filled with dust and thunder. Tanks rumbled forward, engines roaring like beasts charging into destiny. Pascucci stood in his hatch, goggles shielding his eyes, as the Italian armored line advanced. In the distance, the Shermans emerged from the haze, calm, steady, terrifyingly unhurried. The Italians could already sense it. This would not be a contest of skill or courage. It would be a test of whose nation could build faster, bigger, and longer. And the answer was already coming toward them. Row after row of steel giants rolling forward with the confidence of a country that could replace every machine lost, while Italy could barely replace one. The stage was set, the lines were drawn, the machines were ready. And in the hearts of the Italian tankers the first seeds of doubt began to grow. The battle had not yet begun fully, but already something felt irreversibly wrong. The air seemed to whisper what no one dared say aloud: "We are not fighting equals, we are fighting inevitability." The moment the tanks closed distance at Alamein, the battlefield transformed into a furnace of metal, sand, and terror, where every second felt like the last. Engines roared and the earth trembled as the Italian Ariete division pushed forward in formation, M1340th's tanks grinding across harsh terrain, their crews gripping controls and triggers with white knuckles. Second Lieutenant Luigi Arbib Pascucci stood half outside the turret, wind and grit slicing against his face as he spotted the enemy shapes emerging clearly now through the heat haze. The Shermans were not just tanks, they looked like moving fortresses, taller, wider, smoother in motion, advancing with a confidence that felt almost arrogant. For a heartbeat, the desert fell still. Then the Americans fired. The first incoming round struck an Italian tank ahead of Pascucci, and the result was instant. A bright flash, a deafening crack, then a fireball lifting sand and steel into the sky. Pascucci heard someone yell over the radio, voice cracking, "They hit us before we were even close." But retreat was not an option. The Italians pushed forward, trying desperately to close the distance, because only at close range did their 47mm cannon have any real hope of punching through a Sherman's armor. Shells howled overhead like angry gods. Another M1340 was hit, its riveted armor bursting inward, turning into deadly fragments that shredded its own crew. The battlefield became a maze of exploding fuel, ruptured tracks, and burning steel. Pascucci's tank fired its main gun, the shock of the recoil slamming through the hull. To his relief, the round struck a Sherman. For one brief moment the crew held their breath, but the shell bounced harmlessly away, sparking off the thick front plate. One of Pascucci's men whispered, voice hollow, "Dio ci ha abbandonati." God has abandoned us. Yet still they fought. The tanks kept advancing. Italian tankers, exposed and outmatched, showed a courage that defied logic. One crew fired while their tank burned around them. Others maneuvered desperately, trying to flank the Shermans, knowing a side shot was the only real chance they had. The British and American tanks moved like a coordinated machine, radio communications guiding them with surgical precision, while many Italian commanders still relied on flags, hand signals, or unprotected shouting through hatches. The turning point came when the Shermans formed a firing line and unleashed round after round at long range, systematically dismantling the Italian advance. Tanks brewed up one after another, orange flames sprouting across the dunes like burning flowers. Black smoke coiled upward, staining the sky. Pascucci's tank took a hit. The shell smashed into the hull, shaking everyone violently, bursting lines and filling the cockpit with choking smoke. His gunner coughed blood but stayed at his post. Another hit cracked the turret plate, sparks raining down. Pascucci made a decision, one that would be remembered long after the battle. He ordered his wounded crew to fall back, but he himself turned his tank toward the Sherman line and advanced at full throttle. It was not strategy, it was sacrifice. His tank thundered forward alone, gun firing again and again in defiance rather than hope. A surviving Ariete tanker would later say, "He charged like a knight." He knew he was already dead. His final shot struck a Sherman's track, disabling it. One small victory in a sea of loss. Seconds later, 3 Sherman guns turned toward him. The final shell hit with surgical precision, splitting the tank open, fire consuming what remained. By afternoon, the Ariete division was shattered, its tanks silent, its battlefield littered with burning wrecks. But the British radio log recorded a final message from the Italian division before they fell silent, a message that stunned their enemies and defined their legacy forever. The Ariete has ceased to exist. But the Ariete fought. When the guns finally fell silent at Alamein, the battlefield was no longer a place of strategy or ambition. It was a graveyard of steel and humanity. The air still burned with the smell of engine oil, cordite, and the lingering smoke of tanks that had fought until there was nothing left to give. The Ariete Armored Division, once proud and defiant, was reduced to scattered wrecks. Twisted M13 40 hulls half buried in sand, some still smoldering, others eerily intact but silent, their crews gone. The British patrols moving through the aftermath expected chaos, resistance, or wounded men begging for water. But instead they found something that left even hardened veterans stunned. Italian tank crews, many sitting beside their destroyed machines, not fleeing, not fighting, but silent and hollow-eyed, as if the battle had not just destroyed their tanks, but their belief in victory itself. Only a handful of Italian survivors knew the fate of Luigi Arbib Pascucci, but word spread through whispered voices. He died charging alone, giving others a chance to survive. To his own men, he was no longer just an officer. He became a symbol of what bravery looked like when the outcome was already written. But the consequences of that day did not stay in the desert. The Battle of El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in North Africa. Rommel's forces retreated west, leaving behind prisoners, equipment, and the final hope of Italian armored warfare. Within months, many of those Italian tankers, those who survived, were captured and transported thousands of miles away to America, a destination they had never imagined. When they arrived at camps in places like Camp Hereford, Texas, they expected misery, hostility, perhaps starvation, because that was what war had taught them to expect. Instead, they were handed clean uniforms, full meals, medical care, and something even more shocking, respect. They saw American trucks lined up by the hundreds, aircraft flying overhead in numbers unimaginable, factories producing supplies faster than they could be consumed. They heard rumors of production lines capable of building a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, and tanks being produced in the tens of thousands, over 49,000 Shermans built by the time the war ended. And slowly, painfully, a realization took root among them. They had not been defeated by better soldiers. They had been defeated by an industrial machine beyond comprehension. Some POWs wept, not from humiliation, but from the understanding that they had been sent into battle in machines that never should have faced the Shermans in the first place. Over time, something unexpected happened. Italians who had once sworn loyalty to Mussolini began volunteering for Italian service units, working alongside American troops, repairing vehicles, farming land, even building military infrastructure. They were still prisoners, but they were treated as future allies, not enemies. Some wrote home urging families to abandon fascism. Others carried new ideas: democracy, opportunity, dignity, ideas they had never been permitted to question before. When the war finally ended, many Italian POWs returned home not as broken men, but as changed ones. The story of El Alamein, of Pascucci, of the Ariete division, of obsolete tanks facing unstoppable Shermans, did not remain just a story of defeat. It became a turning point, a lesson written in fire and steel, that courage without support is tragedy, that nationalism without industry is illusion, and that sometimes a nation learns more from losing than from winning. In the end, the legacy of those Italian tankers was not their destruction, but their transformation. They entered the desert as soldiers of a collapsing empire, and left history as part of the generation that helped rebuild a new Italy, one not forged by war, but by change. In the end, the story of the Italian tankers at El Alamein is not simply a tale of defeat. It is a reminder of the painful truth that bravery alone cannot overcome overwhelming odds, and that courage sometimes means fighting even when the world already knows the outcome. Those young men inside their thin-skinned M13 40 tanks showed a kind of strength that cannot be measured in armor thickness or firepower. It lived in their willingness to advance into the mouth of danger, to hold the line when logic said to abandon it, and to believe in their duty even when reality shattered their expectations. Pascucci's final charge, hopeless, reckless, necessary, was not the action of a man trying to win a battle, but of a leader trying to save his men, proving that sacrifice can echo far louder than victory. Yet the lesson of El Alamein stretches beyond heroism. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable relationship between ideals and capability, between human spirit and the machinery of war. The Italian soldiers discovered firsthand that patriotism and pride cannot manufacture tanks, cannot build supply lines, and cannot replace fallen machines at the rate an industrial superpower can. And when those same men later stood on American soil, no longer enemies but observers, they understood something deeper. Strength is not just found in might, but in the systems, freedoms, and unity that fuel a nation's ability to endure. Their story reminds us that losing a battle does not mean losing dignity, and that sometimes defeat becomes the doorway to transformation. The tanks they fought in are now rusted artifacts. The nations they served have changed, their world vanished with the war, but the legacy of their bravery and the humility born from facing unstoppable force endures. So as you listen to their story, ask yourself, when everything around you proves you cannot win, do you run or do you stand and fight anyway? Not for victory, but for honor. In the grand sweep of history, the Italian tankers at El Alamein did not win the day, but they earned something far rarer: respect, transformation, and a place in memory as men who fought long after hope was gone. Their tanks burned, their divisions shattered, and their ambitions collapsed beneath the weight of American industry and modern warfare. Yet the survivors carried home something greater than orders or ideology. They carried truth. They had seen how courage meets reality, how loyalty becomes sacrifice, and how defeat can become the first step toward rebuilding a better future. Many who once fought under a dictator later stood for democracy, and the very soldiers who faced the Sherman became part of the Italy that rose from the ashes of war. El Alamein was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of an illusion, and from that ending, a new chapter began. In the desert, their tanks fell silent, but their legacy did not.